My name's Sraddhagita, and it's really nice to see you all this afternoon. So I'm going to be talking about living wisely. So throughout the day there have been talks. The first one was living with awareness, and there's also been a talk called living with kindness. Just had living ethically, now we're having living wisely. So they're all quite practical in a way, things to do. So you could say that living with awareness, living with kindness, living ethically, all those things will enable us to live wisely. Okay, but the first thing I want to ask you is, do you know anyone who's wise? So just take a few moments to think about, do you know anyone who is wise? And maybe someone immediately comes to mind, maybe you have to think quite hard, or maybe nobody comes to mind. But my first question is, do you know anyone who is wise? And if you do, what are they like? What is this wise person like? How do they live? What have you noticed about them? Come in, Hannah. So we're just looking at the question, do you know anyone who is wise? Okay. And if you do, what are they like? How do they live? What have you noticed about them? And what is it about them that makes you think they are wise? In what ways are they wise? Are they always wise? Okay, so maybe if you thought of someone that was wise, maybe you could just call out some of the qualities that you thought about in relation to this person, or a quality that came to mind. So a wise person, what would they be like? Did none of you think of anyone who was wise? In any situations at all?
Yes,
Kindness. Kindness? Yeah.
Non-judgmental.
Non-judgmental.
Rational.
Rational. Open. Any other qualities of someone who's wise?
Ordinary.
Pardon?
They are just ordinary
Ordinary.
and yet extraordinary.
And yet extraordinary. Okay, yeah.
I think they take their time to respond. There's a pause when they respond to you.
So they take their time to respond. So maybe as we hear these qualities, we can just sort of listen to them and see if they resonate with us as well, in terms of what we think of as someone who's wise. So I guess it's probably unlikely that we'll know somebody who is completely wise in all situations. But if you can't actually think of anyone, you could think of a fictional character, maybe from a book or a film. Someone, again, might spring to mind in your favourite book or your favourite film. Someone who acts wisely. Maybe there's somebody you can think of straight away. Can anyone think of a character in a film or a book that they think is wise?
Gandalf.
Gandalf.
Yoda. Yeah.
But even if you don't know anyone who's wise, you could also still try and imagine what it would be like to be wise, or what the qualities of being wise might be. Because if you don't know anyone who is wise, you still must have an idea of what a wise person is like, because they wouldn't be like anyone that you know, basically, if you can't think of anyone who's wise. So, again, I'm going to ask you, what do you think a wise person would be like? Any more qualities?
Aware.
Aware. There aren't really right or wrong answers. I'm just, in a way, trying to get us into the kind of mode of thinking about a wise person, how they might be.
Indifference to adulation or, abuse.
Yeah. Okay, so indifference to adulation, abuse, to whatever happens, just there with whatever happens. So kind of equanimity or something like that, maybe? Yeah. Okay, so you might think that someone is unwise. We'll go on to a bit now, something about being unwise. So maybe you think someone is unwise because they quickly and easily lose their temper, for example. Or they're touchy when they're given feedback or criticised. So then, if you do think that, then you must think that someone who's wise doesn't do that. Okay, so they can listen to feedback, critical or otherwise, without reacting to it, without being sort of agitated. And they aren't easily provoked. So it's quite interesting to think about what you think of as being unwise and also what you think of as being wise. So there have been, I think, lots of studies done probably over the years asking groups of people like what they think a wise person might be like, what kind of qualities they might have, and probably the qualities would, I guess, move into 3 categories. So there'd probably be emotional qualities, there'd probably be more cognitive qualities, and then maybe more reflective qualities. So maybe the emotional ones might be things like empathy, understanding in terms of tolerance, those kind of things. Reflective category, there might be something like intuition. The more cognitive might be obviously intelligence. But I guess even with the word cognitive and the word intelligence, I would link that very much to the emotional category too, because in Buddhism, for example, the mind-heart is one thing. It's a word called chitta, heart-mind. So I would also say there's emotional intelligence as well as cognitive intelligence. So I think that's quite important. So we're just going to, for a moment, think of one of those qualities that we thought of. And we're just going to sit and just maybe close our eyes. And first of all, just think about that quality. So say it was the quality of equanimity or being spacious in how you respond to people. Just think about that for a moment. Perhaps close your eyes. Just think about that quality. Could be kindness. Could be intelligence. Could be rational. First of all, just think about the quality. Maybe think about the characteristics of the quality. And then after a few moments of thinking, seeing if you can stop thinking and just feel into the quality. So if you were that quality, how would it feel in your body? What would the emotional flavour of your experience be? And what would the quality of your mind be like? And then maybe you could spend a moment or two just trying to bring to mind a time when you acted from a quality like this, the one that you're thinking about. And then slowly just opening your eyes. So we only really had a few moments to do that, but the reason I wanted to do that is to really emphasise the point that, well, there really isn't a quality called wisdom that is somewhere out there. I think that there are only really wise people, or people who act or live wisely. People who embody wisdom and conduct themselves in a wise way. And I think we can start to learn from those people. We can start to, in a way, gain or draw inspiration. They can encourage us and inspire us to actually start to act and behave maybe a little bit more wisely. Sometimes I ask myself in certain situations, how would my friend Dharmadina act in this situation? She's someone that I see as more wise than me. So sometimes I ask myself, what would she do? How would she respond to this? And I find that quite helpful. So I think it's important to think about any wise person that we know. And in order to really think about them, we have to really notice what they do. So one of the things we want to learn to actually start to see someone living wisely is we have to look, we have to notice. We have to keep looking at people, how they respond to things, and we need to see them in lots of different situations. So sometimes the quality, I'm going to take a quality now of being wise. So one quality could be peacefulness, for example. So the quality could be an expression of being wise, or we could become wise by being peaceful. So what would that mean? We can develop a quality by being wise, we can express it, or we can become wise by being peaceful. So we can act as if, even if we aren't peaceful, we can not react. We can create a bit more space around how we do act. And I guess if we take this quality of peacefulness, well, when we are peaceful, we probably are more likely to be wise, aren't we? If we're agitated, if we're upset, if we're stressed, we're probably not going to be able to act as wisely as we might if we were more peaceful. Because what we often do when we're agitated or stressed is we keep feeding that agitation. And one of the great things about learning to meditate, I think, is that you start to create a little bit more space in your own mind and heart. And then you can start to respond more creatively and wisely to whatever happens in your life, to whatever happens to you. So in the Buddhist tradition, there is a practice of reflecting on the wise, or on the Buddha really, as a being who embodies wisdom. So the Buddha completely embodies wisdom. It's completely natural to a Buddha. A Buddha is awake and wise all the time. So I'm going to read you something about the qualities of a Buddha. So the Buddha was asked, how do wise people see things and how do they behave? And this is from an old sutta, from the Sutta Nipata, which is one of the oldest Buddhist texts, and it's called the Puradubha Sutta. So this is what he says. So, wise people, they have no anger, no fear, and no pride. Nothing disturbs their composure, and nothing gives them cause for regret. They are wise people who are restrained in speech. They do not conceal anything, and there is nothing they hold on to. With equivociousness or envy, they remain unobtrusive, and they have no disdain or insult for anyone. They are not persons who are full of themselves, or persons who are addicted to pleasure. They are gentle and alert, with no blind faith. They show no aversion to anything. They are not persons who work because they want something. If they get nothing at all, they remain unperturbed. Their mindfulness holds them poised in constant even-mindedness, where arrogance is impossible. They make no comparisons with the rest of the world as superior, inferior, or equal. Because they understand the way things are, they are free from dependency, and there is nothing they rely on. This is what I call a person who is calmed, a person who does not seek after pleasure, who has nothing to tie them down. They are persons with nothing in them that they grasp as theirs, and nothing in them that they reject as not theirs. They are persons who receive false criticism from other people, but who remain undisturbed and unmoved by their words. So one of the things from that sutta that immediately strikes me is that a wise person or a Buddha doesn't compare themselves. I'm really struck by that because it's something that we all do so much, don't we? They have more money than me, that person has, is fitter than me, has a bigger car than me, has less or more grey hair, or less wrinkles, more wrinkles, more boyfriends, less boyfriends, etc., etc. There's a constant comparing that can go on in our lives. But we could ask the question, well, what is unwise about comparing ourselves? What's the effect of comparisons and comparing ourselves? What's the effect of it on our mind and our heart? We could also ask ourselves, how much do I do it? How much do I compare myself with others? How does it affect my relationships with those people? Well, one thing that comparisons can do is it can create a kind of victim mentality, a kind of chip on the shoulder, which can slowly become a bigger chip and a bigger chip. But a wise person doesn't do this. That's really interesting, I think. A wise person doesn't compare themselves. So how would it be not to compare? But we could even compare ourselves unfavourably with a wise person, couldn't we? We could think, well, she's so serene and composed, and I'm just, bad-tempered, grumpy person. I might appear serene, but actually, really, compared to that person, I'm really not. So we might start to do that. But interestingly, what we're doing then is we're making the quality all about us, rather than trying to develop the quality. So what we're doing is we're making it about me. I'm not as good as this person. I'm not able to develop X because I'm always grumpy, or whatever it is. But really what we need to do is focus more on the quality. How could I develop this quality of not comparing myself? Or if it's the quality of contentment, how could I develop that quality? And how would we see the world if we were able to do this? How would we see the world? So I think it's important to, again, feel into these qualities, try and really think about them, but also feel into the qualities of being wise, being kind, being peaceful. If you do reflect on the qualities of the Buddha, you could read the Buddha's life story, which would show us, or show you, how the Buddha behaved in all sorts of situations, when provoked, when not provoked, in all sorts of challenging situations. But even if you don't know much about the Buddha's life, something might get communicated to you even by an image, such as this Buddha sitting here. So sometimes when people come to sit in this meditation room, what strikes them is a kind of atmosphere, an atmosphere that is being created by lots of different people meditating here together. But also this figure imaginatively expresses what wisdom would be like. It expresses that to us. The Buddha in this image is gold, okay? So gold like the sun. So that wisdom is shining, that wise quality is shining. His poise communicates quite a lot, doesn't it? That quiet depth, the way he's sitting, there's a sort of imperturbability about him. People have come and gone from this shrine room over 40 years. This Buddha's just sat here through it all, through all the different states of mind that people have come in to. He sat there without judging, just sitting there, this image. So the Buddha figure here is like a mountain, like a golden mountain. So the qualities can then be revealed if we start to look at an image through the beauty of the image. And I think that's quite important as well. We don't always need to think about things. Sometimes we can see them more poetically because they're evoked by an image or evoked by something. So you'll notice when I was reading that sutta earlier that love, kindness and compassion wasn't really mentioned, but they were more implied as qualities. So they were implied in lines like, a wise person has no disdain or insult for anyone. Okay, but it didn't say that a wise person acts with kindness, but in a lot of the phrases that were used, it was clearly implied. So that's also important. And I think the seeds of acting kindly, living kindly, and also living wisely are in the meditation practices that we teach here. So the practices of the mindfulness of breathing, which is a practice that develops more and more awareness, which is one of the qualities that we drew out earlier when I was asking you about what a wise person might be like. But also the practice of the metta bhavana, or loving kindness, has the seeds in it to take us all the way to really being a compassionate person. So it's important to see that we've already got practices that can send us or move us in the direction of being wise. And interestingly, at the end of the Buddha's life, when his companion Ananda was asked about the Buddha and how he would remember him, he said he would remember him as he who was so kind. So he didn't say he would remember him as he who was so wise, so peaceful, so energetic, but he who was so kind. So you could say compassion or kindness is the action of wisdom. So compassion or kindness helps us act wisely, or is the action of acting wisely. So, what can we do to start to live and act wisely? Well, we can live with more awareness, we can live with more kindness, we can start to live more ethically, but we can also act as if we are wise. We can try and act as if we were a Buddha. That might feel like there's this huge gulf, and in a way, well, there is in lots of ways, but how do we narrow that gulf? The Buddha was a human being as we are human beings. The Buddha was born as we are born. What the Buddha overcame, we too can overcome. The Buddha is our human potential at its kind of pinnacle, if you like. So one thing that the Buddha said we could do is reflect on how things are, how reality is. What is the nature of reality? What is the nature of things? So one way we could do that is reflect on everything that happens to us and try and see what are the marks of everything that happens to us. So the three traditional marks of existence are impermanence, suffering, and that there is no fixed or independent self. So the suffering does not mean that there isn't joy. There is joy, but of course when joy ends, we often experience pain. So there's also the suffering of impermanence. But I'm just going to focus a little bit on impermanence. So we can reflect on everything that happens to us. We can reflect on change and impermanence. But we have to be a bit careful that it doesn't just become this kind of thing that we don't think about anymore. We can easily say all things are impermanent. In a way, it's blindly obvious, isn't it? But do we really live our lives as if that is the case? Do we act as if that's the case? Do we actually pay urgent attention to impermanence? There's a Zen poet called Ryokan who I really like, and he says, "I'll tell you a secret. All things are impermanent." In a way, it's not a secret. He's just, in a way, making a joke about our denial of impermanence. So we have to keep reflecting on impermanence. If you came into this shrine room every day for the next week, and if you looked at these flowers, you would start to see impermanence. If you really looked, you would start to see how these petals, well, in a way, they're already starting to slightly curl. And if you kept looking and you kept looking, you would see impermanence manifesting in front of you. So the thing with impermanence is we can just keep looking at what's around us. Nature is a fantastic teacher of impermanence. And in a way, I think beauty is a really good way to start to look at impermanence, because beauty attracts us. We want to move towards beauty. But beauty always involves impermanence. Within beauty, the arising of beauty, there's also the ceasing of beauty. As the magnolia tree flowers in springtime, the flowers do not last that long. Soon the petals fall and that beauty ceases, or it turns into a different beauty. So I think one of the tricks with focusing on or reflecting on impermanence is not just to reflect on the endings of things, because all the endings lead to new beginnings. There is always arising and ceasing and arising. It's quite hard to let that in sometimes, because there are some things that, we don't want to end or change, and some things we do. Impermanence has loads of positive aspects to it. It means that we won't stay stuck in a traffic jam for the next 2 hours, because sooner or later something will move, won't it? But it also does mean that, these beautiful flowers will fade. What we hold and carefully try and save will eventually fall away. So I think to live wisely, we have to really take this on board, and we have to try and, feel it more and more deeply. And I think it's important to do that when we're healthy and when we're young, as well as we grow older. So it's easy to start to look at our own impermanence. If we look at photographs of ourselves when we were a baby, we have become a totally different person. I remember going to an exhibition at the Tate some years ago where a woman took a photograph of herself every year. And slowly over time you saw her ageing process. Some years there wasn't much of a difference, and then it starts to slowly speed up, doesn't it? I noticed this myself recently because I'm applying for a new Irish passport. I'm half Irish, so because of Brexit I decided to reapply for an Irish passport. And when I last applied for an Irish passport, I was quite a lot younger. So I looked at my old passport photo from quite a few years ago, and then I looked at the new passport photo, and I got a bit of a shock. I looked at myself and I thought, what has happened? But of course, that's been happening, and I have noticed it. But it's just interesting sometimes when we catch ourselves or we see an image of ourselves and we think, wow, I have been subject to impermanence. Something has changed quite dramatically. So sometimes it catches us unaware, doesn't it? So it's good to reflect on or look at the impermanence of our own body. Our own breath is another thing we can reflect on. The breath. Is it our breath? Is it permanently ours, or do we just inhale it temporarily and then let it go? We can also start to look at how we respond to change. How do we respond to change? What happens when we notice things changing? We could say this phrase to ourselves, this too will change. When we're with an elderly relative, we could say, this too will change. When we break a cherished bowl, this too will change. We can, as I said earlier, reflect on everything that happens to us. We can contemplate a valued object and its impermanence, like ourselves, our bicycle, if that's really important to us, our breath, as I've already mentioned. We can also use poetry to help us reflect on impermanence. We can also use art. I remember going to look at some portraits by Rembrandt some years ago, and there were quite a few portraits, and I noticed that the earlier portraits of him that he'd done were very different to the later ones. The later ones had a different quality to them. It was like he'd looked more deeply at himself. And there's a painting of Rembrandt, a late self-portrait in Kenwood House. And if you ever go there and you look at that portrait, I think it reveals a lot. It reveals a lot about impermanence, but it also reveals a lot about someone who's vibrantly and radiantly alive. So in that portrait, he's an old man. But at the same time, there's something that shines from him in this portrait, because he's carried on looking at himself over and over through painting these portraits over many years. So I think we have to keep looking and noticing, keep paying attention. When we do that, we can then start to find some more emotional equivalence to our intellectual understanding. Because in a way we can easily understand that all things are impermanent, but as I said earlier, it's very hard to actually live our lives as if that was the case. So to live wisely, we need to live with the fact of impermanence and experience that in our own being. And that includes reflecting on the experience of death, because death is also part of life. And in the Buddhist tradition, there are 4 reminders which encourage us to practice, and the first 2 reminders are to reflect on both the preciousness of life and the precariousness of life. So the beauty, and at the same time, the ceasing of that beauty. So some lines from a puja, or a little verse that I sometimes reflect, I'm just going to read. So this life I must know as the tiny splash of a raindrop, a thing of beauty that disappears even as it comes into being. Therefore I recall my inspiration and aspiration, and resolve to make use of every day and night to realise it. So I think if I lived like that, I would be living wisely. So I would be really living my life as it is, the tiny splash of a raindrop, a thing of beauty that disappears even as it comes into being. I would try and recall my inspiration and aspiration, and I would resolve to make use of all the time I have to act in a wise way, to act in a kind way. But that is my aspiration. I fall short a lot of the time. But I keep reminding myself of this, and I keep trying to practice reflecting on impermanence, trying to reflect on the qualities of the Buddha. I'm just going to read something about Rembrandt's portraits from a poem by Elizabeth Jennings. So this is what she says. Rembrandt's late self-portraits. You are confronted with yourself. Each year the pouches fill. The skin is uglier. You give it all unflinchingly. You stare into yourself beyond. Your brush's care runs with self-knowledge. Here is a humility at one with craft. There is no arrogance. Pride is apart from this self-scrutiny. You make light drift the way you want. Your face is bruised and hurt, but there is still love left. Love of the art and others to the last. Experiment went on. You stared beyond your age, the times. You also plucked the past and tempered it. Self-portraits understand, and old age can divest, with truthful changes, us of fear of death. Look, a new anguish. There, the bloated nose, the sadness and the joy. To paint, to breathe, and all the darknesses are dared. You chose what each must reckon on.